Recorded this interview back in early June. So thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to see you both. I think, Roman, you may know this, but you were responsible for one of my favorite episodes as mayor, which is getting a new South Bend flag designed, because I saw your talk, evaluate our flag, and found that it literally hit every single qualification you identified of a bad flag. It didn't just have a picture on a flag or text on a flag. It had a flag on a flag. It was a flag on a seal on a blanket. And we thought, we're going to change this. And I'm really glad we did. It was great.
Yeah, I was really honored to see that I had some influence in that regard. That was really nice to see. Well, thank you, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, for being on the 99% Visible breakdown of the Power Broker. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
So my first question is, early on in the Biden presidency, you said this in a press conference.
I'm still surprised that some people were surprised when I pointed to the fact that if a highway was built for the purpose of dividing a white and a black neighborhood, or if an underpass was constructed such that a bus carrying mostly black and Puerto Rican kids to a beach, or it would have been, in New York was designed too low for it to pass by, that obviously reflects racism that went into those design choices. I don't think we have anything to lose by confronting that simple reality, and I think we have everything to gain by acknowledging it and then dealing with it.
And so all the power broker heads in the world knew exactly what you were talking about when you said that. But many people, maybe some in good faith, maybe some in bad faith, were surprised, or at least they feigned surprise in some way. Can you talk about the variety of responses you got from that statement?
Yeah, I was taken aback by how controversial it was. I know there's always controversies about what to do next in transportation policy, but I imagined, perhaps naively, that it was widely understood that these decisions about where roads and other pieces of infrastructure go, sometimes also about where they don't go, reflect these patterns of exclusion. And this is something that was documented. It's documented certainly in some of the anecdotes that emerge in the Power Broker, but also just known as something that happened not just in the South, but in places from St. Paul, Minnesota, to Pittsburgh, to Syracuse, to places like Birmingham and Atlanta, and part of what was really puzzling to me was who today stands to lose by acknowledging this historic fact. And that's part of what I was trying to get at, too, in my remarks, is nobody's worse off because we're taking this seriously. In fact, what's exciting to me about this moment and what's in the Biden infrastructure package is the resources to do something about it. So when we talk about these problems, we're not just wallowing in the harms. We're taking account of the harms and then getting involved in the remedy. And that's what's really exciting about this moment. Not that we're erasing every historical harm, but that we're finding specific places where federal dollars help to divide a community. And we're using federal dollars to help reconnect those same communities.
Can you talk about that? Like, what does the current infrastructure bill, how does it address those past injustices, and how do you make it so it connects a community?
Infrastructure bill is it contains dedicated funding for this. We just put out about $3.3 billion through a program called Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods. For folks who are watching really closely, which probably includes some of your listeners, it actually stitches together two sets of funds. One was in the Inflation Reduction Act. Another was in the infrastructure bill itself, but they all added up into these billions of dollars to do things like stitch back together Chinatown in Philadelphia, where a route called the Vine Street Expressway, really in a slow motion disaster for the Chinatown community, in a process that began in the 60s and continued through the 90s, cut that community up. And we're capping over it to put them back. We're doing something similar in Atlanta. There, the project is called The Stitch. We're over $150 million in to help that. In Buffalo, it's the Kensington Street Expressway that came out of our first round of this programming, where we're teaming up with the state of New York to put a cap in there. It's not always putting a cap over a depressed highway. Sometimes there are other approaches too. Sometimes you can mitigate this disconnection with something a little more modest than decking over a highway. Sometimes it's a transit mitigation or a pedestrian bridge. But what all these projects have in common is that they are knitting back together a place that was divided. And importantly, we're we're also funding the planning. Sometimes it's going to take a lot of federal dollars just to get the idea on the drawing board so that it can turn into a proposal to go on and do the construction on. But another thing, and I think folks who are attentive to what happened in the Robert Moses era will recognize why this matters. We're investing in a process that engages and empowers the community so that these projects are being done with them and not to them.
Yeah, yeah. So what is your experience with the book, The Power Broker?
I wish I could claim to have read every page of it. It is it is on my bedside table. I would say that I have consulted it more than I could honestly claim to have read it. But like everything from Robert Caro, it is so absorbing. You look at a big brick of a book like that and can't imagine it to be a page turner, and yet it is.
Yeah.
I can't remember actually when I was first exposed. I think like a lot of people, readers in my generation, I knew about the LBJ books before learning that The Power Broker was kind of Robert Caro's arrival. But I'm also just fascinated with him as a figure. I have a nerdy fascination with people's daily routines. I think partly because I could never quite figure out my daily routine in a way that's stable, or at least it's always evolved. And his unbelievable discipline, especially in a field, being a historian, being in the humanities, which is known for, somewhat chaotic work styles and lifestyles, his unbelievable methodical nature, coupled with, I think, the reporter's instinct. He started out as a reporter, right?
Yeah.
I think coupled with the reporter's instinct for how to make things readable and relevant, and the nose for context, I just think it's something that is really compelling. And of course now, I first got interested in these things as a mayor when a mayor of a smallish city, South Bend, about 100,000 people, but where we were wrestling with these kinds of questions. And now being in a city which is famously all about the use and exercise of power, and knowing that the Power Broker represents one of the most thoroughgoing and insightful accounts of how all of that actually works.
I was hoping it was going to turn out that you had been inspired directly by the Power Broker, because when you were mayor of South Bend, you did a lot deliberately to make the downtown more pedestrian friendly. And I imagined you reading Robert Moses and being like a punk rocker listening to Led Zeppelin when punk rockers were like, this song is too long. All of my songs are going to be really short. That you would read it and you'd be like, too much cars. My streets are going to be for pedestrians. So that's my fantasy of the situation, at least.
I wish I was that cool and that quick to turn ideas into action. But, I will say I surrounded myself as a young mayor with people who knew a lot about architecture and urbanism. The University of Notre Dame's architecture school is especially committed to some of the principles of new urbanism, many of which I think were a response to urban renewal and the kinds of things Robert Moses was involved with. And that certainly trickled into the kind of intellectual architecture of what we were trying to do. I definitely set out as a mayor, partly because I was so new at it and partly because it's how I do things, to say, okay, what are some principles to go by before we jump into this work? Even the most kind of unglamorous and day-to-day things, there need to be some principles at stake. I challenged myself and my team, for example, to say, okay, what's our philosophy of public work? What's our philosophy of wastewater? And the more we thought about it, it was about freedom, and it was about the idea that your freedom depends on not having to think about wastewater or water. And then we realized that translated into really reliability, and then affordability being our kind of main things we were shooting for in how you run a water utility. Similarly, trying to connect the big things to the small things, the concepts and the ideas to the everyday, definitely motivated what we tried to do when we were reimagining our streets. The streets of my hometown were basically designed to just evacuate the downtown, to blast vehicles through it as quickly as possible. In a pair of the two main kind of north-south streets of our downtown had been turned into this pair of one-ways, which cars were going by so quickly it was hostile to pedestrians. You wouldn't want to walk on that sidewalk. And by changing that, we created a different and more vibrant downtown. And it's funny, obviously we were far from the only or the first community to take that approach, but some of the battles we had within the community. You would have thought that I had made this up single-handedly in the shower, and
you invented the roundabout.
Yeah, and that we were more or less, imposing it on everybody and basically banning the automobile. And it actually helped to get some top cover from this department where I now serve. We got an award. It might have been the first time I came into this building that I'm now sitting in as I speak to you. Was to receive an award from the then Secretary of Transportation, Anthony Fox, for the work that we were doing. Back then, there wasn't a giant infrastructure bill to fund us to do the work, but even just getting a lot of top cover to say we might be on the right track was a big shot in the arm that helped us pursue that philosophy and that strategy on our streetscapes.
Yeah, that makes me think of another difference between you and Robert Moses, because if Robert Moses was in that room getting that award, he would have been thinking, I'm going to take this guy's job someday. I'll be Secretary of Transportation someday.
Yeah, it definitely did not cross my mind when I was here then that I'd be coming back to the building in that. But
now you got to watch out for everyone you hand an award to, that they're coming after you. Yeah.
So in the section of the book that we were talking about for this episode, the big drama that concerns it is about whether the Brooklyn Battery Crossing should be a tunnel or a bridge. And every piece of empirical evidence is that the crossing should be a tunnel. But Robert Moses wants it to be a bridge, and he has the funds to build it, to enforce his will, and only the power of the president stops him. And there are a lot of weird biases when it comes to infrastructure that is worthy and exciting, but I feel like you really only understand the importance of infrastructure if you love replacing a lead pipe or putting sensors in the sewer as much as you love building a bridge. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, a sewer system, or for that matter, a lot of tunnels, but definitely a wastewater resource, isn't something you can point to. It isn't something that you can put your name on. Again, to my earlier point, its elegance often is in the fact that you don't think about it.
Yeah.
The way I always approach and conceptualize these things is, the less you have to worry about whether you're going to get a glass of clean, safe drinking water, or for that matter, whether there's a hole in the road on your way to work, the more free you are to concentrate on whatever lifts your soul, I mean, whatever matters to you in life. Raising your kids, practicing your faith, starting a business, being a scholar, whatever it is. Now, having said that, I mean, bridges are also beautiful, and there are pieces of our infrastructure that play this elevating role in addition to this functional role. And I think about that a lot. Although even that, too, I think is best understood by bringing it back down to the everyday. And what I mean by that is, a bridge, the beauty of a bridge, if it is beautiful, just like its utility, if it is useful, matters most because somebody's day goes different, both admiring that nice bridge on the skyline and, getting to where you're going on time. They do add up into somebody's everyday life goes a little bit better because that thing is there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds a lot like you're articulating very well our kind of in-house philosophy that we talked about on previous episodes, that an acronym that I call Noticeably Improve People's Lives, or NIPPLE. And it's a for term I'm not having a lot of success or luck getting off the ground.
Yeah, I might work out a different acronym for use in federal policy here. But yeah, all right. What was it again? Noticeably
improve people's lives. But you could just say NIPPLE and people know what you mean, I think, most of the time.
Yeah.
I'm really coming off as the shock jock of the two co-hosts on this podcast.
You're making me think, though, because I think part of the tension in what we do as a department is some of it is noticeably improve people's lives for sure. Like, I want you to see these great airport concourses that we're investing in improving. And I want you to know that this happened because we got this bipartisan infrastructure law, and it happened because of President Biden's leadership. On the other hand, like, the most important things we work on in transportation should not be that noticeable. I mean, especially because first and foremost, we're a safety organization, right? Yeah. So like, you shouldn't notice that you didn't get injured or killed, on your way to work. Like, that should be something you don't even have to think about. And that side of our work is actually one where, no news is good news. So I'm half with you. Like, I think a lot of times, especially when you're trying to get credit for good policy, it's very important to noticeably improve people's lives and make sure you remind people how it got done too. And there's this whole set of questions and moral as well as political about how credit is accumulated and distributed, which I might have some more thoughts on if you want to explore that. But then there's the other side of it where kind of the less people know you're there, the better. And that's how maybe part of that's my mentality from having been in the military and being involved in counterterrorism too, where like, a good day is when nobody even knows that you did what you're doing. You just protected them and they get to go about their lives.
Yeah.
It's curious that you bring up the idea of credit, especially because so much of Moses's ability to navigate politics was about the apportioning out of credit for things, that he got a certain amount of credit for parks and people liked him, but he was always sure to include elected officials in the debuts of the openings of his projects so that their names would be attached because he knew they wanted the credit and they would support him if they could get it. And I wonder if that kind of calculation calculation's kind of like a sinister way to describe it, but that part of calculation is part of the politics of running a department like this, where like you're saying some things are noticeable, some are not, and how the credit gets spread around in order to get that kind of support or that kind of approval or other types of checkpoints met to get projects accomplished.
Yeah, look, that's a thing, right? And up to a point, not to sound too naive, but up to a point that's a really healthy thing. Like part of how it's supposed to work in a democratic system is you as a government official deliver something for people. They notice that you delivered it for them, and they give you credit for that, and you get to keep your job. Or you fail them, and they're mad at you, and you don't get to keep your job. Right? Like that on some level, that's the basic logic of electoral democracy. And I think it's definitely important to me as I travel the country to make sure that I talk about the different people who helped us get something done. If I'm in Pennsylvania, I want people to know that a bipartisan law that was led by President Biden and was supported by their senator, Bob Casey, helped us get this bridge done that we're fixing in Philly, or these safety dollars going to make a safer streetscape in Lancaster. Now, one interesting thing about how our funding works is that the vast majority of it actually is not of the form of discretionary grants where our team puts together a list and then it's brought to me for a final sign off and we're literally picking and choosing winners and losers. There is a lot of that. There's a record level of that, and we try to have very clear principles for how we make those choices and be transparent about them. But for every dollar that we have going out that way, we have many more dollars that go out by a formula where we just give it to the state. And within certain limits, they can use it however they want. And what's really interesting to me is that some states and some governors will go out of their way to share the credit, to put up signs on the side of the road to make sure that everybody knows this happened because of President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure package and a partnership with the state. And some of them won't. Right. But for those who do, I mean, the alchemy of that, and this, again, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna, but I really honestly believe this is true. My favorite rule of political mathematics is that if two willing parties, like a federal administration and a governor or a mayor who work together, if they each come in willing to share the credit, each one of them walks away with 2/3 of the credit. I don't know how it works, but there's kind of a magic to that I love.
Yeah, I see that.
And then, look, obviously, as a matter of fairness, I also consider it important if somebody tries to share in the credit for something they tried to stop, like some of the members of Congress who celebrate projects that are going to their districts funded with the bill that they voted against and in some cases attacked. We're going to call them out on that, because I think it's just a matter of fairness there.
Yeah.
We're still going to fund it if it's a good project, but we're if they're if they're going to be cheeky about making it sound like they're the ones who brought the project there, we're going to have something to say about that. I don't think that's I don't think that's unnecessarily political. I think it's just about fairness.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. And it's interesting because something that's come up as we've talked on the series is kind of the ways that to operate productively in politics, to do things for people, you need to have traits that at least, we're taught as children or through fairy tales and things are not the ideal traits. Like you need a certain amount of ambition for power in order to do things, and you need a certain amount of getting the credit in order to continue that support. Whereas I feel like what we're taught when we're young is to be that kind of like Gary Cooper, Lone Ranger humility, where you're like, I didn't do anything, I'm just another man. I know I stopped all these people, but anyone would have done it. Whereas if you do that in politics, you will not effectively get the support you need to get the things done that you're there in the first place to do, most likely.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think there are a lot of different ways of being effective. I would definitely say some of the most effective people I've encountered since getting this job are not the ones who get their name all over the place. That's one way to do it, especially for elected officials.
This sounds like that counterintelligence mindset again.
Maybe because in the military, there's always the person who, according to the org chart, is the person who will get something done, and then there's the person who will actually get something done. Like when I was deployed, I was a very junior officer. Like my most important responsibility probably was driving equipment or other people who outranked me around Kabul or between Kabul and Bagram, and we didn't actually, even though that was an important part of my job, I didn't actually have direct control of any vehicles. So to get a vehicle, I had to really think about it. And there were two ways to do it. There was an official way to do it. It took forever, and sometimes I would never get a vehicle. And then there's this guy named Marlin, who to this day, I don't know what his job title was. I don't know. He's a civilian. I don't know what organization he was part of. I just knew that if I stayed on his good side and made sure that I helped him anytime he needed something and gave him first dibs on the chocolate chip cookie bars that came in the care packages from South Bend, Indiana to my little mailbox in Afghanistan, I get my hands on a Land Cruiser when I needed one. And that really mattered. And so all of which is to say there's a lot of different ways to do this, right? And I do think sometimes we get wrapped up in the myth of somebody who uses hard or even nefarious means to get something done as kind of the way, right? And it's fitting, again, that we talk about this in the context of Robert Caro book, because I do think his scholarship on LBJ got a lot of people thinking about LBJ, who delivered so many of these incredible results, including this is in many ways credited with the civil rights law that was one of the most important social leaps forward we've had as a country. But there's this idea that, he, in terms of how he treated people, was a real bastard, and that's what it took to get those important, worthy things done. And there's a whole mythos around that, that, we can have long historical debates about how much that's really the right account of what happened. But the point is, that's what people think works a lot around here. And some of them really lean into that in ways I would argue are actually counterproductive to their long-term effectiveness.
That makes sense to me. So one of the things about Robert Moses is that he had this idea for how New York should be, and it should be, dominated by cars. He loved being a passenger in a car. He never learned how to drive, but he loved being a passenger in a car. He grew up in a time period in which, driving was this, leisurely activity. People didn't do it to commute. They did it for fun. And so he was really into this idea of parkways, and he shaped New York in that image. And he really did not pay attention to the changing world. He had just had an idea that was fixed. And no matter what amount of empirical evidence sort of, contradicting that, just didn't work on him over the decades that he ruled. And I sort of thinking about this when it comes to being, in charge of, transportation in the country, and thinking about it, how much do you nudge? I mean, obviously no one should do what Moses did, and just steamroll over everything with this one ideology that doesn't change. But you do want to shape things and move things to be kind of different than they are now, and not just build on what's already been built. How do you think about balancing that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to come in with a vision. Again, your account of the principles, the ideas, the concepts. And sometimes that means pushing. I mean, I was definitely pushing my community back in my formative years as mayor, with ideas that I believed in, that I really think we were right about, a well-placed roundabout was going to save lives. Yeah. And a lot of people hated it. And, in a democracy, you're supposed to be accountable to where people, you're supposed to be accountable to people, and at the same time have a responsibility sometimes to lead in a direction that wasn't already how people thought. I mean, in fact, you could argue by definition, you're not leading if you're just going to where people already are. Yeah. And so then the tension becomes, how can you legitimately be responsive to people, which means listening and being open to the possibility that you're wrong and being ready to adapt your plan, and still be doing your job as a leader, which is to arrive with a vision and try to persuade people. So when are you persuading people, and when are you letting them persuade you? I think that we have a lot of process that goes into that. If you're at the local level, like I come out of, a lot of public meetings, that were probably not as much a feature of Robert Moses' life, but as a mayor, I mean, when I think about our complete street stuff, we counted into the dozens the number of public meetings we had. And I viewed them largely as persuasive, largely as an opportunity to say to the community, we really need to do this, and here's why. But we really did adjust and adapt and rethink our plans because of the input we got. And if I'm being honest, also because the city council made me to some extent. I couldn't get what I wanted to through on the first try without some adaptation. So there was that push-pull. But I still wouldn't have been doing my job if I just kind of polled people on what they already thought and went along with it. At the federal level, there's a much more kind of thoroughly designed version of this, which is, especially when you get into something like an environmental impact statement. So on the biggest, gnarliest, most complex projects, federal law requires that if federal dollars are involved, there's a very intensive process of getting comment. And we have had, whether it's projects or whether it's certain rules that we've been considering, literally get tens of thousands of comments. You go in on regulations.gov, which is a real website. It sounds made up and doesn't sound very exciting. But, when we propose something that we're eventually going to make into a rule or contemplating making into a rule, everybody gets to weigh in. And somebody has to read all of those comments. And that's good, right? Because we're making rules that everybody has to live by. So I don't know that, everybody kind of draws the line somewhere. But I think any leader earning their paycheck is not simply reflecting the population they serve, but also is not a good leader if they're ignoring the population and the community that they serve. Mm-hmm. And by the way, one other thing I want to say, which is the deployment of political capital, right? If you are for something unpopular, and if you are right that it is the right thing to do, then you do kind of a trust fall where you implement that policy and hope that over the years it delivers enough good results for people that they wind up giving you credit for it. That's what I felt like happened with the kind of arc of my first term as mayor. Spent the first year, a lot of people got mad at me because of the things we proposed, things we tried to do. By the fourth year, I had enough results to show for it that I could earn enough trust to get reelected and go at it again. Here in this administration, I feel like we're on a similar arc where we spent year one, just getting this infrastructure bill through. Now we're in the fourth year, turning it into actual results, and hopeful that earns credit.
Mm-hmm. As Roman was saying earlier, that this episode that we're covering before this interview airs, so the listeners will have just heard this, but I'm going to recap it slightly anyway, is about the building of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel and how he wanted it to be a bridge, and it took the President of the United States stepping in and pressuring the War Department not to give navigable waters permission for it to get it stopped. And it feels like so much of this is emblematic of an earlier era that was not as standardized and formalized as the process that you're describing now. And there was no Department of Transportation at the time. It wouldn't be around until the 1960s when Moses was already basically out of power. And it makes me wonder how you would handle this kind of situation now, or if this kind of situation arises of a sort of master builder, master planner type who has local control, local influence, and is trying to push through something very big using federal dollars that maybe isn't a good idea. Does the federal government have more tools to handle something like that now than it did back then, when literally the president's wife had to say to him, you should do something about this? And the president said, oh, yeah, let's not do that.
Yeah, look, there are more tools now. We're very careful and very conscientious about the fact that a lot of these decisions are local. For example, 54,000 projects and counting that we're funding through the Biden infrastructure package, 0 of those projects was invented here at the US DOT headquarters in Navy Yard. All of them were developed by some city, town, state, tribe, airport authority, transit agency, and then brought to us or got funding through a formula. And so we're very intentional about not dictating the terms of a project. And at the same time, we have policy goals, right? Safety, job creation, climate equity. And to the extent that the law provides for us to do so, we shape things largely by which projects we select for funding in competitive processes and by other lawful means to be a certain way. And, other tools that didn't exist before are really designed to protect the rights of people who could be impacted by a project, notably Title VI of the Civil Rights Law that we enforce, so that if people are about to get rolled Robert Moses style, they have recourse, and we come in as a watchdog or as an enforcer, really, to make sure that those people are heard. But I'll also say this: one thing I've learned in this job, or relearned in this job, is the importance of informal or unofficial power. And I'll give you an example that's less in the realm of building things, but is one of the most important things we've worked on, which is how airlines treat their passengers. So there are some things we've been trying to get done and are still trying to get done through rulemaking. But the rulemaking process, the Administrative Procedures Act, the notice and comment, it can take years. While we were working on that, especially in the summer of 2022, when there were so many frustrations around cancellations and delays, the idea emerged that if we just put more information out in a really easy to understand form, that not only would help passengers know which airlines would take better care of them, but knowing it was out there might actually change the airline's behavior. And, living in this world where it takes months or years to do something, I asked the team, well, okay, if we set up a website, like how long would that actually take? And they said, we could do it in a couple of weeks. And I said, okay, well, I'll send a letter to all the CEOs of the airlines saying, hey, in a couple of weeks, we're going to put this website up. You might want to change your customer service plans before we do it, because there's going to be a bunch of green check marks and red X's. And they did.
Wow.
This was not an enforcement action. We've done those. This was not a rulemaking. We're doing those. This was just saying, hey, we're going to tell people what you're doing, so you might want to think about what you're doing. And it led to real change. And so I've been amazed at how powerful those tools can be when used alongside tools like rulemaking and enforcement and spending money.
Yeah, yeah. Of those sort of 54,000 projects that you mentioned, I hope I got that number right.
Yeah.
Don't ask him to tell us every single project, Roman.
No, but I'm wondering, like you strike me as a real systems thinker. Like you really enjoy solving a problem. And is there a certain type of project that really delights you in the way that it's the type of solution that it is, or like I don't know, the fact that I'm sort of struck by, like, I've always felt like your wastewater sewer thing in South Bend was just like great. You know what I mean? And it is one of those things that absolutely passes by without notice. Is there a type of project that really delights you when you hear about it or it comes across your desk?
Yeah, I love the projects that have a disproportionate impact in the places that they benefit. And often those are actually smaller projects. They're not our marquee national headline projects. Obviously, I love the high-speed rail we're doing from Nevada to Southern California.
Yeah, me too.
We're contributing $3 billion to make that happen, and it could be amazing. But again, I mentioned I was just in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's just fresh on my mind because it's the last one I visited. $12 million. We're going to help them do safer streetscapes. That is both a kind of a vote of confidence in the mayor's and the city's strategy of adding bike lanes, not in the idea that it's ornamental, but actually for safety purposes, taking some one-way roads, turning them into two-way, accepting that traffic can be a minute or two slower in exchange for a real safety payoff. That isn't our biggest dollar amount, but is something that we know is going to make a difference. We were in Chamberlain, South Dakota. This is a community that's 2,500 people, but believe it or not, they have an airport. And that airport really matters because they do air ambulance missions in a community that's a long drive from the nearest major hospital with a trauma center. And we're just getting them a building for their airport. Right now, it's basically a manufactured home. You can tell it's kind of a double wide. They've done a nice job with it, but they need an actual brick and mortar building. And for less than $1 million, we're getting them one. Yeah. Those kinds of things are especially gratifying because how, and maybe it's just because of where I come from. I was mayor of a smaller, mid-sized city. How impactful they're going to be, and so I stack those right up alongside the, what I often call the cathedrals of our infrastructure that we're working on.
Yeah. I remember when the eastern span of the Bay Bridge, it was rebuilt. I'm from the Bay Area. Yeah. And the construction was running late, and they canceled the event where you could walk across it before it opened. And I was so bummed. Like I wanted to take the kids, I was like, there was this moment that I felt like that was just kind of lost in us just exalting in this idea of this thing that we built that, like, only a government can build. Like Amazon can't build it, Apple can't build it. A government builds this, and that's the collective will of the people. And I just wanted to have that moment of celebration. And I miss those. And I feel like we're ripe for having that moment again when it comes to infrastructure.
I love that. And I think we do need to do that. And I think the challenge and the opportunity with this particular infrastructure moment is that it's in so many places at once. So there's not this like the golden spike, like the single thing you can use to mark the completion of this coast-to-coast project of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? It's literally tens of thousands of places getting their golden spike. And I think the style of celebration you're talking about is really fitting for that, and having each community come up with its version of that. And there is something in particular magical about when you give people access to a piece of infrastructure they're already going to use. Like people drive over the bridge every day, but when you walk it, you feel it differently. I'll tell you, that can be really powerful. I've had an experience of occasionally being on a runway to do my job. We either do a press conference on a tarmac that we're about to revamp, or ride along with a inspector going out on a pickup truck. And
you're not sneaking onto runways at night. These are official.
Yeah, all kosher. Yeah. But from a distance, you could be forgiven for thinking a runway is basically like a road. And when you're on one, you realize it's more like a field.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of its scope. And there are things like that when you're on a bridge or a runway or another piece of infrastructure that if you get the chance to interact with it in a non-normal way, it deepens your appreciation for it.
I mean, I honestly feel like there was this wave, this WPA, PWA period in which we took special pride in these things. And there was a extraction period in which we didn't, and we wanted to all public-private partnerships and we didn't want to. And now I feel like do you feel that swell of people wanting to do this stuff a little bit more, a little bit, I don't know. It just seems like we're back into an era where we could build with abundance.
So I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is that I think we need to remember that what we're building is something that should be a source of pride and is not just making up for lost time. And here we may be the victims of our own arguments a little bit, because I think we said persuasively and correctly, hey, for the last 40 years, we've underinvested. We got a huge backlog. Maintenance is a problem. We got to just fix all our stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's true, by the way. We have a whole philosophy around what's called fix it first, the importance of taking care of a backlog. But taking care of a backlog doesn't make the heart soar, right? And the truth is we're doing all of the above. We're definitely dealing with things that should have been done 30 or 40 years ago and making up for lost time in repairing or restoring bridges or tunnels. But we're also doing whole new things. Again, the high-speed rail sphere just being one example of it. And so I think we need to remember to think about the positive, the proactive, how we're going to be not just as good or as far ahead as we once were, but better than ever if we get this moment right. But the other thing I think that is always in play here, especially now that it's not the 30s and 40s and we have other things we pay attention to in terms of environmental impact and workforce and frankly just safety on building things, that means there's some delayed gratification here. The real reason I call the biggest projects we're doing cathedrals of our infrastructure is actually not because it's a poetic word to talk about a big thing. It's a reminder of this central characteristic of cathedrals, which is that the people who built them weren't even around when they were complete. Mm-hmm. Now, unlike the builders of Notre Dame, I very much hope to be alive when we finish the Hudson River tunnels. But it's unlikely that I'll be Secretary of Transportation when that happens. And so, unlike a piece of great, tax policy, and I'm super proud of the tax policy of the administration, the child tax credit, they did it and almost at a stroke in a matter of months, child poverty plummeted in this country. Like, that's amazing. It doesn't work that way when you're building a big bridge or a new airport terminal. And so we need to be as excited and as emotional about a project that takes years to bear fruit as we are about something that gets done almost overnight. And to me, part of how we do that is we take pride in the how. Mm-hmm. one of the coolest things I get to do is spend time with high school students who are in these vocational programs and pre-apprenticeship programs that prepare them. Some of them not going to college, some of them going to college but want to learn building trades anyway. But prepare them to have a hand in this building that's going on. And for all the hand-wringing that's gone on about how our country doesn't do wood shop school in high school anymore and doesn't respect building, I see a real change, a real kind of counterculture thing happening. And these students stand up taller and they're part of it. And my point is, they might be working on a bridge 2 or 3 or 4 years before anybody gets to drive across it, but it's already making somebody better off. And that's something that gets me excited and that I hope we all take a level of pride in.
That's a really exciting way to think about. It feels like one of the big flaws of Moses in the book is this impatience. He's got to get it done. He's got to get it done now so we can move on to the next thing. And when you're building something that will last 100, possibly 200 years or longer, the impatience in getting it built is only going to hurt you in the long run. And you make those mistakes that he made or make those deliberate errors that he made. And there's something very exciting about that idea of focusing on the building of it too, so that the period before the thing is completed isn't just a frustrating period of waiting. It's a period that you can also make the most of and take pride in. I think that's such an inspiring way to think about that process.
Yeah, I mean, Roman, you talked about the participation in an event to mark a project completion, but there are also ways to do that along the way. I mean, this might be a little romanticized, but we often look back to the era of a barn raising, right, where people got together to do something, and part of the fellowship that was created in the doing of it mattered. And I think that's true in a lot of service contexts, in more modern versions of what we do. And by the way, I would even say just the act of putting these resources together, I mean, the political construction project that was the bipartisan infrastructure law, if only because it was a bipartisan law in a horrifically divided time, which is the Washington of 2021, is something we ought to take some pride in. But I do think, look, we need to find ways to celebrate, not just as a political matter so that, people who helped get this done get credit, but to reconnect all of us with our role, because each of us paid into this, right? And each of us should take some pride in this getting done. And it's a big deal. In fact, my big thing, you've got your acronym, Elliot. I've got something I'm trying to get to catch on.
Okay.
Let's see if it's more appropriate than mine. I don't know. We'll see.
So I want the sum total of the Biden era investments in infrastructure, whether it's the stuff I work on or the getting rid of lead pipes or the internet access or any of these other things, to come to be collectively known as the big deal. Mm-hmm. There was the New Deal, the Square Deal, the Fair Deal. I think nothing could be more fitting for President Biden's infrastructure work than the big deal. So I'm going to keep calling it that. We'll see if it catches on.
I like it. Well, Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Same here. Thanks for having me on. And thanks for your attention to these things. They really matter. And they're more fun to talk about and think about than people might realize.